October 1347. The Black Sea port of Kaffa, Crimea. 12 Genoese merchant galleys prepare to depart. Their crews know they are infected with plague. They know half of them are dying. But they also know that staying in this besieged city means certain death. So they set sail, carrying with them the most deadly cargo in human history. Rats infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would kill half of Europe. This is the true story of how one merchant ship's journey from Asia to Sicily changed the course of human civilization forever. And before we begin, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Are you in Italy? In Europe? In a place touched by the Black Death? Let me know where you are, because this story connects us all across 700 years of history, tragedy, and transformation that shaped our modern world. The journey begins not in Sicily, not even in Europe, but in Central Asia, in the vast steppes where empires rose and fell like waves upon an endless ocean. In 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde army led by Khan Yani Beg was conducting one of the most devastating sieges of the medieval period. Their target was the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea, on the northern shore of the Black Sea. Kaffa was one of the most important trading posts in the medieval world, a beacon of commerce and wealth. It was the gateway between East and West, the place where Chinese silk and spices from India flowed into European markets. For decades, the Genoese merchant republic had controlled this strategic port, fortifying it with massive stone walls and towers that stretched toward the sky like monuments to human ambition. The city was rich, powerful, and seemingly impregnable. The merchants who lived there believed they could withstand any siege. They were wrong. They would soon learn that the greatest threat does not come from military weapons, but from invisible enemies measured in microns, from pathogens so small they cannot be seen by the human eye. The Mongol army surrounding Kaffa was enormous and terrifying. Estimates suggest between 60,000 and 200,000 warriors surrounded the city, creating a human wall that stretched for miles across the landscape. They brought siege weapons, catapults that could hurl rocks weighing hundreds of pounds, battering rams capable of breaking through stone and wood, towers on wheels that allowed soldiers to climb the city walls. For weeks, they bombarded the city walls relentlessly. Day after day, night after night, the sound of warfare echoed through the streets. The ground shook from the impact of rocks. The walls cracked and crumbled. But the Genoese defenders held firm. They had held firm for years. The walls were strong, built to withstand exactly this kind of assault. The defenders were experienced warriors who had fought in many sieges and wars. Supplies were adequate because the city had been preparing for a long siege. The merchants had stockpiled food, water, weapons, and ammunition. The siege seemed to be reaching a stalemate. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The Mongols could not break through the walls. The Genoese could not break out of the city. It seemed as though this siege might last for years, draining the resources of both sides. And then something changed. The Mongol warriors began to die. Not in battle, not from wounds inflicted by defenders, but from disease that appeared without warning. Plague had struck the Mongol army with devastating force and terrible speed. The disease had originated somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, possibly near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, though nobody knew this at the time. Medieval people did not understand the concept of disease transmission. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas. They did not know about rats. They did not know about any of the mechanisms that allowed plague to spread. To the Mongol warriors, the plague was simply death descending without warning, without mercy, without logic that they could comprehend or fight against. Soldiers who had been healthy and strong the day before were suddenly covered in buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, plums, and walnuts. Their flesh turned black as blood vessels burst and tissue died while still attached to living bodies. They burned with fever so intense that some soldiers threw themselves into the sea, hoping that cold water would bring relief. They experienced pain beyond comprehension, as if fire was spreading through their veins and arteries. They screamed. They begged for death. They died within days, often within a week of first symptoms appearing. The plague spread through the army with terrifying speed that nobody could stop or prevent. Thousands of Mongol warriors fell. Estimates suggest that up to 30% of the Mongol army died from plague during the siege. The army that had conquered so much of the known world, the Mongol hordes that had seemed invincible, was being defeated not by weapons but by an invisible enemy. And then Kanyani Beg made a decision that would alter world history and shape the course of human civilization for centuries to come. He could not capture the city through conventional siege warfare. His army was dying. His soldiers were abandoning him to escape the plague. His generals were questioning his leadership. His authority was crumbling beneath him. So he decided to weaponize death itself. He decided to use the very plague that was destroying his army as a weapon against the city. He ordered his men to load the corpses of plague victims onto catapults and hurl them over the city walls. This was not merely warfare, this was biological warfare, crude and brutal but devastatingly effective. This was an early example of weaponized disease, a tactic that would not be seen again until modern times. The corpses landed in the streets and courtyards of Kaffa. Some historians describe piles of corpses so high they formed small hills inside the city, creating nightmares of death that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. The people of Kaffa tried to dispose of them, throwing bodies into the sea, digging mass graves, attempting every method they could imagine. But it was too late. The plague had already taken hold inside the city walls. The biological attack had succeeded where military weapons had failed. The walls could not protect them. Weapons could not save them. Only escape remained. Rats scurried through the city. Medieval cities were always full of rats, living in sewers and walls and cellars, thriving in the filth and waste that accumulated in densely populated urban centers. They fed on the corpses, on the food supplies stored in warehouses and homes, on anything they could find. And the fleas living on those rats were vectors for plague. The bacterium Yersinia pestis moved from corpse to rat to flea to human with mechanical efficiency and relentless precision. One flea-carrying plague could infect dozens of humans. Dozens of infected humans could infect hundreds. Hundreds could infect thousands. Thousands could infect entire cities. The multiplication was exponential, growing beyond anyone's ability to control it. The mathematics of plague spread like an unstoppable equation. Within weeks, Kaffa itself was infected with plague. The people who had built this great trading post, who had grown wealthy from commerce, were now dying from an invisible enemy. The city that had resisted military siege was falling to biological siege. The defenders of Kaffa realized that no walls could protect them from this enemy. No weapons could fight it. No tactics could defeat it. No courage could overcome it. By 1347, Kaffa was a nightmare of unimaginable horror and despair. The streets were filled with bodies of the dead and dying. The smell of death permeated everything: clothing, food, water, the very air itself. The stench of decomposing corpses became so overwhelming that people covered their faces with cloth soaked in perfumes and spices, hoping that pleasant smells would mask the horror. The living were dying faster than they could be buried. The burial systems collapsed. Graves filled faster than they could be dug. Cemeteries became so crowded that there was no room for new bodies. The priests ran out of holy oil for last rites. They ran out of prayers. They ran out of hope. The survivors faced an agonizing choice: remain in the city and die of plague, or flee and hope to escape the disease. If they stayed, they would certainly die. If they fled, they might die from plague caught during the journey, or they might survive and carry plague with them to new cities and new populations. Both choices were terrible. Both choices led to death. Yet most chose to flee. Among those who chose to flee were merchants and sailors of the Genoese Merchant Republic. They were practical men, accustomed to calculating risk and reward. They understood that a dead merchant cannot conduct business. They understood that their wealth meant nothing if they died. So they boarded ships. And they sailed away from Kaffa, hoping to leave the plague behind. They did not know that they were bringing the plague with them to the heart of Europe. 12 Genoese galleys departed from Kaffa in the summer of 1347, at various times as they finished loading cargo and recruiting crews from the surviving population. These were massive merchant vessels, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo and dozens of crew members across vast distances. They were built for long voyages across the Mediterranean, designed to withstand storms and carry valuable merchandise across thousands of miles of open sea. Their hulls were made of oak, reinforced with iron bands, topped with multiple masts and sails that could catch the wind. Their holds were divided into sections for different cargo. Their holds were filled with valuable merchandise, silks from China worth their weight in gold, spices from India and Southeast Asia that could cure diseases or preserve food for months, gems and pearls from the Indian Ocean trade, glass from the Middle East, and countless other goods worth small fortunes in European markets where demand for Eastern goods never ceased. But beneath the merchandise and above it and alongside it, in every dark corner and cargo hold and storage space and crevice, were rats. Thousands of rats. Tens of thousands of rats. The merchant ships of the medieval period carried rats by necessity. Rats were impossible to prevent. They fed on the ship's supplies. They bred continuously. They multiplied exponentially. They died and their bodies rotted. And on those rats were fleas, Xenocilla chiopes, the oriental rat flea, carrying Yersinia pestis in their digestive systems, infected and deadly. The ships sailed west from Kaffa. The voyage would take weeks, perhaps months, depending on weather and the number of stops and delays. The first stop was Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, the greatest city in the medieval world, the jewel of Eastern Christianity. Constantinople had been infected with plague for weeks already. Ships from Kaffa had been arriving there continuously, bringing infected crews and infected rats. The Byzantine historian Nicephorus Gregoras, who lived through the plague and documented it, wrote that the plague killed so many people in Constantinople that it was impossible to bury them all. The son of the emperor died of plague. Bishops died. Generals died. Merchants died. The poor died. The rich died. The healthy died. The sick died. The city that had been the center of Christian civilization for 1,000 years was being consumed by disease and death. When the Genoese galleys arrived in Constantinople, they took on supplies and water. They hired new crew members to replace the sailors who had died during the voyage. They also took on more infected rats and fleas. Then they departed, continuing their journey westward toward the heart of Europe and the Mediterranean centers of power. The ships sailed through the Aegean Sea, moving between Greek islands and Turkish coasts with the winds and currents. At each island, they stopped for supplies, fresh water, food, repairs to damaged sails and rigging. At each stop, they left plague behind. The Greek islands that had been inhabited for thousands of years, since ancient Greek civilization had flowered there, suddenly found themselves facing a new enemy. They did not know the danger. They did not understand what was happening. The island of Crete was infected. The Venetian port city of Candia, on Crete, was hit hard and fast. The coast of modern-day Turkey was infected with plague. The island of Rhodes was infected. The island of Cyprus was infected. The island of Corfu was infected. The island of Zante was infected. Everywhere the galleys touched, plague followed like an invisible shadow. The traders on these islands did not understand what was happening. They did not know that the merchant ships bringing valuable goods were also bringing death. They saw the ships arrive. They saw transactions occur. They saw merchants come ashore to purchase supplies and conduct business. They did not see the rats. They did not see the fleas. They did not see the bacteria. By the time symptoms appeared, by the time the first islanders fell ill with fever and buboes, the ships had already departed for other ports. Meanwhile, 2 of the 12 galleys had separated from the main fleet during the journey. These 2 ships had a specific destination: Messina, Sicily. Messina was one of the most important ports in the medieval Mediterranean. Merchant ships from all over the Mediterranean stopped at Messina. It was a hub for commerce, for communication, for the flow of goods between East and West. It was Sicily's window to the world and Europe's window to the Orient. If the plague was going to reach Europe, Messina was the logical entry point. The other ships sailed toward Venice, toward ports in Greece and the Balkans and the northern Mediterranean. But these 2 galleys were heading for Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, the strategic gateway to southern Europe. The voyage from Constantinople to Messina took weeks of sailing. During those weeks, the crews of the 2 galleys were dying in increasing numbers and at accelerating rates. Sailors who had been healthy when the ships departed Kaffa were now covered in buboes. Their flesh was blackening. Their bodies were shutting down. Some were already dead, their corpses weighted down with chains and stones and thrown overboard to sink into the Mediterranean Sea, creating a trail of plague markers that no one could see. The captain knew something was terribly wrong. He had seen enough disease and death to understand that this was not ordinary illness. But he also knew that if he revealed the true condition of his crew to the authorities in Messina, the ships would be quarantined and his cargo would be confiscated or burned. He had invested everything in this voyage: his savings, his credit with merchant banks, his reputation in the merchant community. The cargo represented his wealth, his status in society, his future and the future of his family for generations. So he made a choice that would have consequences for millions of people across the centuries. He decided to hide the plague. He ordered the dying sailors to remain below decks, out of sight of observers. He ordered the bodies to be thrown overboard at night, when they could not be seen by harbor officials. He prepared a false accounting of his crew. He made plans to claim that his crew was healthy, that there was no plague aboard, that everything was normal and safe. The two galleys approached Messina in October 1347. The date is recorded as October 1347, though some sources suggest early November, but the exact date matters less than what happened next. The ships approached the harbor, flying the Genoese flag, signaling their peaceful intentions and legitimate trade. The ships requested permission to dock at the harbor. The harbor master, seeing valuable merchant vessels arriving with merchandise from the east, did not see any reason to refuse permission. Why would he? Merchant ships arrived every day from many ports. Plague was not something he had heard of. Constantinople was far away. The Byzantine capital was another world, distant and remote. Messina was a prosperous port city where merchants made fortunes trading with the East and selling exotic goods to wealthy Europeans. There was no reason to suspect danger from merchant ships. The harbor master gave permission. The ships were allowed to pull into port. Crew members disembarked, though not many, and those who did were carefully chosen. The healthiest sailors, those who showed no signs of disease, those who could conduct business without raising suspicion. Cargo was unloaded carefully and inspected by merchants. Merchants came aboard to inspect the goods and negotiate prices. And infected rats and fleas scurried onto the docks of Messina, Sicily. They dispersed among the warehouses and markets and homes of the city. They dispersed to every corner of Messina. They began their work, spreading plague with mathematical efficiency and unstoppable force. Within days, people in Messina began to get sick in increasing numbers. First 1 case, then 2, then 10, then 50, then hundreds, then thousands. The illness was strange and terrifying and unlike anything they had experienced. Fever that burned so hot people thought they were on fire and lying in hell itself. Swelling in the groin and armpits, black buboes the size of apples and plums. Black discoloration of fingers and toes as tissue died while still attached. Vomiting blood. Delirium and madness. Death within days, sometimes within hours. The people of Messina had never seen anything like it. None of them. None of the doctors who had studied medicine for years. None of the priests who had devoted their lives to faith. None of the government officials who managed the city. Doctors were baffled by the symptoms and the speed of death. They had no treatment. They could not cure it. They could not even slow it down. Priests performed last rites, then caught the disease themselves and died. And the disease spread. It spread through the port district where the ships had docked. It spread to the wealthy merchant families who had come to inspect the cargo and conduct business. It spread to the poor who worked on the docks and loaded cargo. It spread through the streets where people walked. It spread through neighborhoods where families lived. It spread through the entire city with unstoppable momentum. Within weeks, Messina was dying. The death toll climbed with terrifying speed. Hundreds died. Then thousands. Then tens of thousands. The city's hospitals filled to capacity. Then overflowed with bodies. The churches filled with corpses waiting for burial. Then they ran out of space for more bodies. The cemeteries filled. Then they ran out of room. The city was drowning in plague. The Sicilian authorities realized they had a catastrophe on their hands and a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. They held emergency meetings in the government buildings. They debated what to do. They consulted with doctors and priests and military commanders and civic leaders. They considered every option that could possibly help. and they reached the conclusion that they could contain the disease by removing it from the city. They quarantined the ships, but it was too late. The rats had already left the ships. The fleas had already spread through the city. The population of Messina was already infected. The disease was already unstoppable. In desperation, the authorities attempted to contain the disease by driving infected people out of the city. They forced the sick to leave and never return. They forced anyone who showed symptoms to depart immediately. These refugees fled to other parts of Sicily. They traveled inland, away from the coast, carrying plague with them in their bodies and their blood. They traveled to other cities and towns. And everywhere they went, they carried plague with them. The disease spread like a wildfire across Sicily. From Sicily, plague spread north to mainland Italy across the sea. It reached Naples, the great trading city on the Bay of Naples. It reached Rome, the spiritual center of Christian Europe and the seat of the Pope. It reached Florence, the center of banking and commerce and Renaissance culture. It reached Venice, the great maritime republic that rivaled Genoa. It reached Milan. It reached every major city in Italy. It climbed the Italian peninsula like a wave, unstoppable and inevitable, driven by merchants and refugees and travelers who did not know they were carrying disease. By 1348, every major city in Italy was infected. From Italy, it spread to France across the Alps and across the sea. It reached Marseille, the great port city. It reached Paris, the greatest city in Christendom at that time. It spread along the Mediterranean coast to Spain and Portugal. It reached the Atlantic coast of Western Europe. It crossed the English Channel to England. It traveled north to Scandinavia and Russia. It penetrated as far east as Russia and Constantinople and as far south as Egypt and North Africa and the Middle East. By 1349, plague had reached every corner of Europe that could be reached by sea or land routes. The entire medieval world was infected. All of this happened because 2 merchant ships sailed from Caffa to Sicily in 1347. All of this happened because a captain decided that profit was more important than honesty and human life. All of this happened because rats and fleas found their way onto merchant vessels crossing the sea. All of this happened because medieval people did not understand that invisible enemies measured in microns could be more deadly than armies of warriors and weapons. All of this happened because of one decision, one voyage, one moment in history when circumstances aligned perfectly for catastrophe. The death toll was incomprehensible and shocking beyond imagination. In 5 years, from 1347 to 1352, approximately 75 million people died of plague across the world. Some estimates go as high as 100 million or more. The global population fell from approximately 365 million to approximately 310 million. That means 1 in 7 humans alive was killed by plague. In Europe, the population fell from approximately 75 million to approximately 40 million. That means more than half the population of Europe was killed. In some cities, up to 90% of the population died. Entire villages ceased to exist completely. Historians found villages where every person had died of plague. The buildings were intact. The fields were plowed. But there was no one alive to maintain them or live in them. The medieval world was fundamentally transformed by plague. Society was shattered. The economy collapsed. The church was challenged. Feudalism was weakened. Art changed. Literature changed. Culture changed. The entire civilization was remade in the image of plague and death. But the story does not end in 1352. Plague never really left Europe. It became endemic, meaning it established itself permanently in the rat and flea populations of Europe. It returned in waves, killing millions more in subsequent centuries and generations. There was the plague of 1361 that killed another 20 million people. There was plague in 1375. There was plague in 1400. There was plague in 1450. There was plague in 1500. For 400 years, plague returned again and again, a recurring nightmare that killed more people than all the wars of Europe combined. The Black Death of 1347 was the initial catastrophic wave, but plague remained a threat to European civilization throughout the medieval period and into the early modern period. The threat never disappeared. Even today, plague exists in our modern world. There are still cases reported in Africa, Madagascar, and Central Asia each year. The bacterium Yersinia pestis has not disappeared or been eliminated. Modern antibiotics control the disease effectively, but the organism that killed 75 million people 700 years ago still exists in nature. If antibiotics became unavailable through some catastrophe, if we suddenly lost our modern medicines to disease or war or collapse, plague would kill again at medieval rates. We are separated from medieval catastrophe not by biological immunity but by fragile medicines that could fail. So where did it all start? With two merchant ships sailing from Caffa to Sicily in October 1347. With rats and fleas traveling in cargo holds beneath silks and spices. With invisible enemies measured in microns. With a moment in October 1347 when merchant ships pulled into the harbor at Messina and changed the course of human history forever. With one captain's decision to prioritize profit over honesty and human welfare. With one sick rat and its fleas. That is all it took. One rat. That is how half of Europe died. And that is how one merchant ship's journey from Asia to Sicily killed half of Europe and changed the world forever. If you're watching this from Italy, from Sicily, or from anywhere in Europe, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are. Tell me your city, your country, your region. Because this story connects us all. 700 years ago, the plague came to your ancestors. Today, we remember them by understanding how it happened, why it happened, and what it means for our world today. Comment below and let me know where you are watching this from. Are you in Messina? In Sicily? In Italy? In Europe? Are you in a place that was touched by the Black Death? Comment and let me know your location. Because this story is your story. It is the story of your ancestors. It is the story of how one moment, one decision, one merchant ship changed everything forever for all humanity.